There is this kind of peculiar philosophical statement I like from a Kurt Vonnegut novel, The Sirens of Titan. Now, it's Vonnegut, so it's incredibly convoluted, and I'm going to try and explain things in a way they make sense, but it's difficult. Essentially, this line is spoken during a scene in which Malachi Constant, who was once the world's wealthiest man, returns to Earth after a journey to Mars and then being stranded on Mercury. He finds that the people of Earth have all adopted a new religion, following the Church of God, the utterly indifferent. And in a crowd of adherents to this new faith, Malachi's identity is suddenly revealed to them. They do not like this. This particular faith sees Malachi as a spoiled, entitled man who fails to realize that his fortune is the result of luck rather than his own work, and who fails to be appropriately grateful for this good fortune or sufficiently altruistic with the gifts given him. If you follow politics, this probably sounds somewhat familiar. The crowd is largely right in their assessment, and being somewhat bloodthirsty, their reaction to this revelation is to send Malachi in a rocket to live in exile on one of the moons of Saturn. It's sci-fi, it's a thing. Shortly before all of this happens, in a manner of foreshadowing, the founder of this religion says to Malachi, once the wealthiest man on the planet, he says, they'd like it just as much the other way around, you know. If the big reward came first and then the great suffering, it's the contrast they like. The order of events doesn't make any difference to them. It's the thrill of the fast reverse, which is to say that we as humans love to see the poor and suffering built up and the fortunate and powerful brought down, and it doesn't actually matter to us whether good fortune or bad occurs first, only that whatever happens is reversed. Now, reading from Luke today revolves around this kind of reversal, and you might miss that aspect if you, as most people, immediately replace Luke's Sermon on the Plain with Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, which is more familiar. The differences between these two, as Hank pointed out to us, nearly all amount to Luke being more direct and more emphasizing this reversal of fortune. For instance, Matthew softens his message of economic and social reversal, where Luke writes, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." Matthew writes, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God." Who are the poor in spirit? I don't know. Could be me, could be you. We all know who poor people are. Poor in spirit's a little vaguer. I could be included in that. Who knows? Likewise, where Luke writes, "Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled," Matthew writes, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." Again, there's a convenient way of saying to middle or upper class people here, oh, it doesn't matter that you're not the poor, because it's really all about wanting Jesus and, being poor in your spirit and your heart of hearts. It's lovely. Luke's Beatitudes are also a lot more direct. In his text, Jesus speaks to us. Blessed are you who weep now, rather than blessed are those who mourn. And he adds the subtle now to every blessing. So this lets us know that Jesus is speaking to our own fate, and doing so based on this present moment, where we are right now, right here. More than anything else, though, Luke differs in that he includes corresponding woes for each blessing, which is another thing that Matthew did not have the gall for. He doesn't pull punches. He lays it right out there that the poor inheriting the world means the rich will lose all, and that the feeding of the hungry will happen together with the hunger of those who are full. His sermon is not only a pronouncement of hope for those who suffer, but also that of doom for those who are well off. Luke's gospel features many moments in praise of this reversal between the rich and the poor, perhaps in service of our own love of an underdog story. Not everyone loves it when wealth is redistributed, but we all love to watch those who struggle persevere in the end, defeating those who had more resources, more attention, better odds. And the peculiar thing is, we don't learn to do this. No one ever teaches us to root for the scrappy team of misfits instead of the well-off team from the suburbs. Something in our hearts just tells us that this is a better outcome. You might call it hope, or you might call it some sort of intuition towards justice. Or perhaps it's not nearly so lofty as this, but as Vonnegut writes, we just want to see change. It doesn't matter whether one experiences great suffering followed by big reward, or whether one is granted big reward and later punished with great suffering. We don't seek hope or light or justice, but change. Maybe we're really looking to just hear a good story, and we realize that no story is interesting if nothing changes. Let's be honest, when you get down to it, doesn't it seem equally likely that A, people universally crave the triumph of those who suffer and defeat of those with power, or B, deep down we're all just kind of bored and we want to see something different from our own experiences? We have been thinking here at MCC Boston about what it means for things to be made new, how we crave to see the blossoming of new things and the promise of a new world. But is there, in the end, any way of knowing whether we crave this newness as a way of righting the wrongs of an unjust system that punishes the poor, the lowly, and those who are different, or whether we crave new things just for their newness, seeking a reversal of fortune only as a means of giving ourselves something to talk about? Or if we're really taking a good, hard look at ourselves in the mirror, even if our hearts long to see the poor lifted up and the powerful brought down, is this because we all seek justice in the world? Or is it because we all see ourselves as the underdog and whoever we don't like as the powerful? If you pay attention, we can see attempts every day to portray oneself or one's group as an underdog, even when it's completely and patently untrue. White straight men on the internet love writing op-eds claiming that they're the most oppressed group in the world today. The very wealthy who keep the poor in chains appear as talking heads, telling us all how they're being taken advantage of by a class of moochers and takers, poor babies. Evangelical Christians love to repeat verses about being persecuted for the sake of their faith because, despite the near complete political and economic control of this country, they feel that being asked to treat others as equal is akin to being fed to lions. And of course, we can never, ever manage to make it through February without hearing at least one cry of, "Why isn't there a White History Month?" And to be fair, it would be hypocritical of me to leave all of these examples so squarely in the realm of the right-wing persecution complex. We on the left struggle the same. If you've ever heard the term oppression Olympics, you know what I mean. Often we feel like in order to defend your rights, you must pit your struggle against that of others. In worst-case scenarios, this means that a more privileged group will further shame and stigmatize a less privileged group. For instance, though we certainly all believe in feminism and the equality of women, we must acknowledge that some feminist movements have become the oppressor themselves by refusing to acknowledge and support their trans sisters. Or we may look at the many occasions in which queer white people perpetuate harmful stereotypes that people of color are overwhelmingly homophobic, further stigmatizing people of color and completely overlooking our queer sisters, brothers, and siblings of color. All I mean is that we too tend to center our own oppression at the risk of sometime aligning ourselves with the oppressor. If you will allow me to digress for just a moment, and I'm in the pulpit, so you don't really have much of a choice in the matter. One sees an interesting shift in ideas of persecution in the history of the church. Many recall the early persecution of Christians, but it's often overlooked how Christians immediately after this time struggled to adapt to a world in which they were the majority and no longer needed to fear being persecuted and executed. Given the emphasis in Christian texts on the vindication of those who suffer, there was a genuine identity crisis in the church here that gave rise to monastic communities and ascetic practices such as fasting and self-flagellation. The idea being, Christians must suffer. It's an inherent part of the identity. And if I am not suffering at the hands of others, I will suffer at my own hands to reap the spiritual benefits. This seems odd to us today, but I promise you I have done a lot of research on this. And if you have a saint or another spiritual hero from this time period, I can nearly guarantee you that they made a regular practice of whipping themselves. It's what was done. But in our current era, we have figured out a shortcut around the actual suffering, believing that if we just convince ourselves and others that we are suffering and oppressed, we don't actually have to face any persecution. We all, myself included, are experienced at magnifying the injustice we have suffered while minimizing that of others. So I know that when an alt-right internet Nazi watches The Karate Kid, he doesn't root for the Cobras. He's convinced that he's Ralph Macchio and that the liberals are Billy Zabka, somehow. Because we all innately sense that it is good and right to believe that those who suffer will be vindicated and those with power will be humbled. But we can't always bring ourselves to root for that. Rearranging the world is a lot of hard work, and it requires us to sacrifice ourselves. So instead, we find ways to convince ourselves that we are the underdogs, so we don't have to change anything, and we can just wait for the big reward we are so sure we deserve. And as much as that turfy internet troll is doing that work in their head, so too are you, and so too am I. And if you're saying to yourself right now that it's different for you because you're actually persecuted, please consider that the people you oppose are saying the exact same thing to themselves. This is not to erase persecution and oppression and place us all on the same level, because that would be lukewarm and false. Persecution is real and tangible and by no means universal. But we must pay attention to the ways in which others are oppressed, and often oppressed more than we are. Otherwise, we're only patting ourselves on the back, exaggerating the greatness of our suffering in hope that it will lead to a bigger reward. And there's, of course, the ultimate conundrum. Our hearts all long to see this great reversal of fortune, the mighty brought down, the poor lifted up, but none of us is completely sure which side we're on and which will be reversed to. We seek to justify ourselves and locate our own persecution, but all suffering is ultimately contextual. If you, like myself, are discriminated against as a gay man, imagine being a gay man of color. And if that's your reality, try being a lesbian of color. And if that rings true to you, well, how about a trans lesbian of color? How would they feel? And if all of that applies, well then thank God you aren't a disabled trans woman of color living in a poor village in a colonized nation. I'm not saying that our suffering is not real, but there's always someone who has it harder, and there's always someone who has it easier. And it's disingenuous of us to constantly seek to locate the ones who have it easier at the expense of seeing those who have it harder, which is ultimately what many of us do. It's easy to find ways in which those people we don't like are doing well and to exaggerate that. So allow me then, and again, I'm in the pulpit, so you don't have much choice in the matter, to lend some context to the earlier story I mentioned of Malachi Constant, which again is Vonnegut, it's convoluted, I'm doing my best here. Malachi Constant, once the wealthiest man in the world, I intentionally left out a lot of that story. You see, when we saw him, he was being punished and exiled for being obscenely wealthy and not caring about the poor. However, decades before this punishment, he had already lost all of his wealth, enlisted with the Martian army as a last resort to ensure his survival. Then his memory was erased, his best friend was executed. He spent 3 years marooned deep within the caverns of Mercury with rations dwindling and no visible escape. Only after this 3-year ordeal does he return to the earth to be punished as a man of obscene wealth. Following this, he is sent to the moons of Saturn, only later to be returned to Earth and to freeze to death at a bus stop in Indianapolis, perceived to the world as an anonymous homeless man. My point here is that to the crowd who apprehended him and sentenced him to exile, their actions were justified on account of his obscene wealth. They enacted the reversal of fortune we all long for. But the reality of it is the story is not near so clean-cut as big reward and great suffering. It's big reward, followed by great suffering, followed by greater suffering, and then greater still, then small reward, great suffering, long period of not much happening, and the greatest suffering at all. Would any of us, seeing a man frozen to death, wish for his punishment? Or do we secretly enjoy it, knowing that he was once the rich enemy to underdogs everywhere? Do we consider this a redemption story? Has he really bettered himself? Or does he deserve to be cared for now that he has suffered and been poor for so much longer than he was ever rich? Do the riches of his former life forever merit greater and greater suffering? In the end, are we really looking for change or for balance? I have no idea about any of these questions, and let's be honest, neither do you. When we read the words in Luke about the poor being lifted up and the rich brought down, we think we understand and we cheer for it, but we never really know because our world has never been that clean cut. Of course, there are rich, greedy, powerful men who must be brought down, and of course, there are poor, starving people who must be comforted, but the vast majority of us exist in some space in the middle, and we spend all of our time trying to convince ourselves that we're closer to the bottom so we can be brought closer to the top. But the currents of our world constantly change, and we have no way of knowing where fortune ultimately ranks us. So what do we do with this? Does Luke intend us to give until we become the poorest alive? That's a possibility. And no matter how much other preachers will try to convince you it's not necessary, it could be. Should we, like our ancestors of the monastic era, live in the desert, fast for days, eat only bread, and hid ourselves? Personally, I don't mind this option so much, but I don't believe that producing our own suffering is akin to bringing justice and hope to God's people. Rather, if nothing else, perhaps instead of focusing on increasing our own suffering in hopes of a greater reward, we can hope to increase the rewards of others who suffer in this world. Perhaps we no longer wait to fill the hungry, lift up those who are spoken down to, give the poor their rightful inheritance, and cause those who mourn to laugh. Perhaps Luke's prediction of this reversal of fortune doesn't ask us to consider where we are on the scale of suffering at all, but rather asks us to see the ways in which we are doing well, and which others are in need of help and care. And as I said, I'm not going to take the easy way out here and guarantee you that the answer isn't to sell all your possessions. And I'm not sure at all if that's what I'm supposed to be doing, and I just don't want to do it either. But if that's too much for you, and it probably is because it's too much for me, then consider the suffering of others rather than your own. Focus on bringing about as much of this reversal of fortune as you are able now, instead of waiting to see it in the future. Thank you.